Welcome back to another episode of Spirits Rising, the student Christian movement podcast where we question everything we've been taught about faith. I'm Esther, she, her pronouns.
And I'm Dunc, pronouns they, them. Listen to our unfiltered discussions with awesome guests as we explore liberating spiritualities true to our experiences.
Our guest today is Mother Maggie Helwig, priest at the Anglican Church of St. Stephen in the Fields. Maggie is also a lifelong activist concerned with colonial violence and poverty, as well as a published poet and novelist. We've invited her today to talk about her essay, Non Nobis Domine, A Theology of Money, published in 2016 as the core of an Anglican Church resource on the subject. Dunc, I remember you were really excited when I first mentioned this as a potential podcast topic, as Divi was. What was it about the concept of a theology of money that grabbed you?
Yeah, for me, church and money were very separate ideas. We didn't much talk about money at my home church growing up, and it was never mentioned at our masjid either. Though later on, I did come to learn that most of my family was giving a regular percentage of their income to the masjid for supporting fellow Muslim families in the Middle East who were suffering due to war and violence. Though we learned about 2 years in that this money was actually just going to the imam's family back in the United Arab Emirates,
Ooh.
the UAE. Yeah, so, not actually going to those who truly needed it. And we immediately left that masjid and started going to another one that was far more transparent with their books. And, that was my first experience with money in a religious setting. And it's left a very poor taste in my mouth ever since. We can talk more about Islam and money after the interview, though. In a Christian setting, though, when my family moved to Toronto, our United Church congregation was very transparent with the books to all members of the church, and I was on the payroll since I was legally able to work, and most of that work was in things like food justice and community support. So it was a weird, I guess, kind of look into how the church was financing, these efforts against, I guess, a capitalist society. The United Church itself has made a lot of recent efforts to divest their wealth from fossil fuels and the like in the past decade, but we also aren't supporting our rural congregations as we should. So perhaps a better understanding of the theological framework around income and wealth disparity can help shape how I approach the UCC in the future to advocate for better support to those who need it.
Yeah, that resonates insofar as I grew up in a congregation where there were a lot of fairly open conversations around money and how the way we spend our money reflects our priorities, how we allocate our resources as a community, and particularly around supporting people in need in the community. At the same time, I feel like kind of the missing piece in church conversations has often been kind of a more systemic perspective. I remember a few years back, shortly after Maggie published her essay, she was invited to do a workshop on theology of money at the SCM's Cahoots Festival. And a whole lot of people came to that workshop with very practical questions around, how should I manage my family budget? How should I be thinking about investments and savings, and what are the most ethical options for those?
Which is very much not what the paper is really about, is it?
No, it's that's the piece that's trickier for churches to engage with, is this, a systemic analysis of our economic system, and how it shapes our communities, our personal lives, our collective lives, um, and what what small things we can do as communities to work for systemic change um, rather than focusing on small scale redistribution, which is still very important and necessary. But before we get further into this, I would love to chat with Maggie.
Hey, let's do it. Maggie, could you maybe briefly describe for our listeners your theological framework for money and wealth, maybe talking about how the paper started or what caused it or what inspired you?
It's not really a matter of anything inspiring me. In fact, although I'm very happy to have written the paper and very proud of the contents of it, but the Reverend Jeffrey Metcalf had the idea of forming a subcommittee of faith, worship, and ministry at the National Church, which would look at money from a theological perspective, because his sense was that there's a lot of talk about money around the church, but it's mostly about do we have enough money to make our expenses for the year, and how can we get people to give money to the church, not looking at broader questions of economics and justice and global economic systems and what's going on theologically with this. Because, properly speaking, everything is theological. Everything needs to be looked at through a theological lens. And money perhaps more so than most. The Bible talks about money constantly, and talks about it in some quite unexpected and challenging ways. And there was not much reflection happening on that. So a group was struck. It was myself and a number of other people, and we spent probably over a year having fascinating discussions with each other, and not being sure what we were supposed to come up with at the end of all this. And finally I just said, well, you know what, I'll just write a paper, because I have ideas, and we can see if we like it. And everybody liked it. There were some rewrites, there's some work on it. So it is partly a product of the whole group as well as mine. But the key point, I've been reading a lot about the global economy. I've been reading a lot about the economic basis of a lot of the problems that we're facing. The debt-based economy, the increasingly profoundly imaginary nature of global economies, and yet an imaginary construct which has huge, powerful, devastating, unavoidable impacts on real lives of real people. And turning all this around, and I happened, as part of the daily office, to be reading Psalm 116, which is about idolatry and idol worship. And as I read that, I thought, this is it. This is exactly what we're talking about. It's about creating a construct which has no life, and then allowing that construct to control you until you become the thing that you have created. Hands have they and handle not. Noses have they and smell not. The global economy has no humanity, it has no life in it, and yet it is controlling lives, and it is reshaping lives into lives which serve the interest of the economy rather than the interest of the actual creatures. And once I'd sort of seen that Psalm 116 idolatry connection, writing the rest of the paper really became very easy. So that's kind of the core of what I'm talking about, the way that the global economic system functions in order to reshape us into creatures whose primary purpose is to continue the global economic system. This abstract system which we created is running us, and running us in ways which are very bad for our humanity, regardless of where you fall on the scale, creating tremendous deprivation, tremendous anxiety, tremendous inequality, tremendous dehumanization, detachment, massive environmental damage, as we're increasingly seeing as the climate crisis escalates. And all of this is based on our thinking of money as if it were both natural and neutral, as if it's a thing like the weather, or it's a thing like how vegetables grow, like it's a real thing in the real world. But it's not. It's a thing we created and we made up, and it's doing us and the planet tremendous damage. And we can't just act as if this is just how it is.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that. I mean, I for the past couple of years have never been fully paying off my credit cards because I know if I leave a certain amount of balance and make regular payments, even though I'm paying more in interest, that further boosts my credit score rather than just fully paying off the credit cards every time. And, I'm doing that to boost my credit score because I know that as soon as I'm out of school, that student debt is going to lower that credit score and it's going to make it harder to afford a home. Right. And so I'm paying all this interest now as a starving master's student, so that I can hopefully one day afford a house. But
which is also debt. You will incur massive debt by purchasing it. This is a system which is absolutely built on debt and therefore needs to compel people to incur debt.
Exactly. And
that the Old Testament is extremely clear that this is a really sinful way of proceeding.
Precisely so. So it's like currently I'm doing this master's program in theology, reading the Old Testament, reading the New Testament, seeing what the scriptures say, and yet I feel obligated to participate in this because if I don't, then it's going to make my life harder, right? It's not neutral. As you were saying, it's not a neutral force. It is a force that is being used against very large amounts of the population. And that's something very important and vital to mention. But I guess maybe what I'd like to do is narrow the scope a little bit, and I'd like to ask, what are you aiming to address in the current like church culture surrounding this? Because this is obviously, more of a theological framework, of course, but there does seem to be a I don't know, something there challenging the current system that we have in our own church liturgy or theology or practices or recommendations. So what are you currently aiming to address in the current church culture in that regard?
I think really primarily just the awareness, just to try to people in the church as much as people anywhere else think of our economic system as a natural, neutral, unavoidable, and morally neutral thing, which we can just sort of which we participate in without really thinking about. All I'm really trying to do is make people think about how we participate in the economic system and look at whether there are choices we can make differently. I mean, we are very constrained in this system, as you've pointed out. The system will punish you if you do not obey, if you do not conform, if you do not act in ways that are to the benefit of the system will punish you mercilessly. So we are quite limited in the choices that we can make, unfortunately. But at least to be aware that we are making choices that we are, whether we like it or not, participating in a system which is deeply problematic, and that we need to look at what means we have to escape that. The book of Revelation is an often very misread book, but a great deal of what it's about is, do you have the courage to stop participating in the economic system? Because that's what the author is demanding of his readers. And he is absolutely aware of what it costs. He is absolutely aware that it is often a life or death decision. John of Patmos had no mercy. John of Patmos was like, you accept the emperor's coin, forget it, forget you. You're going down with Babylon. But,
chill.
if on the other hand, they'll kill you anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, John was not a happy man.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, being so aware of, these economic systems and how they're actively working against, the population and such, I guess it would be hard to stay happy, I guess. So would it be safe to say that your paper is more aimed towards starting the discussion in churches and start discussing, the way in which this is not a neutral force, but rather it is a force that is actively working against us?
Yes. I mean, at one point, one of the things we had hoped to do was to have different people from the working group talk about their own context and how they see economic forces operating in their context and what the possibilities for resistance in their specific communities and contexts might be. And I think that would have been really helpful if we had pulled it together, because it is, like many things in theology, very contextual, very much about analyzing your own situation. And the paper is, I think you're right, just hoping to start that conversation and hoping that people can look at their contexts and say, how are economic forces operating on us, on our community, on the community that surrounds us, and what are the possibilities of resistance in this particular context?
Yeah, if I can jump in, remember that in your Theology of Money essay, the first contextual example that you gave of this kind of consciousness of money and how it functions in society is the Occupy movement in 2011, which you described as a transformative moment in our society's understanding of money. So I was an undergrad at the time, and I remember Occupy as a very exciting event that sparked a lot of conversations about wealth disparity and economic injustice. It popularized the language of the 99% and the 1%. And I'm wondering, in the decades since then, what changes have you seen in Canadian political discourse about money and wealth, and what hasn't changed?
Most things have changed for the worse.
Yeah.
Yep.
The concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few people has been getting worse and worse in Canada and internationally, as you know. I think there is more awareness. Can that awareness be turned into anything that changes this dynamic? Or are we just waiting for everything to collapse under its own weight and see what can be rebuilt? I mean, maybe we are in the position of John of Patmos, just waiting for the fall of Babylon and waiting to see what you can build in the ruins after that. That's a super depressing answer.
Yeah.
I think on a micro level, a lot of really interesting things came out of Occupy. My paper wouldn't have existed without it. A lot of interesting writing wouldn't have existed without it. There is an urban gardening movement in Toronto which has its roots in Occupy, which probably wouldn't have existed otherwise. There have been a number of mutual aid projects and connections made which have had Occupy roots. A lot of people met there, and a lot of networks got started there. And a lot of the grassroots mutual aid that we've seen during the pandemic, which really it has made me a little more confident that perhaps we can survive the fall of Babylon. This was like a little weeny tiny test run. Um, and people's mutual aid did spring up in the midst of all this. I mean, we're on a much more moment of a disintegration right now, but a lot of good things did happen, and some of those were rooted in relationships created during the Occupy movement.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely I've seen, I've had more very grassroots community initiatives based on common control, common sharing of resources. Yeah, there's some really exciting stuff happening at the community level, but on the macro level, seem to be heading faster and faster towards crisis. So yeah, who knows where we'll be in 5-10 years from now. That's certainly something I've seen during the pandemic, is the way in which it's accelerated disparities and fed resistance, even while resistance has high costs.
Yeah, I know for sure during the pandemic, I mean, there have been countless online movements as well. There was on Twitter, there was a whole thing for all leftists, people who believed in mutual aid, people who believed in social supports and such. Um, there was a movement with a hashtag no comrades under 1,000. And the point of it was there should be, basically to create a network of people following each other. Ideally, no one should have less than 1,000 followers. People just following each other so that you can have, an update and a community online of people who are politically motivated the same as oneself, to support you, to support others, to create that sort of, mutual aid benefactorship, and that really did explode. There was so many people that created these sort of like coffee links or Patreons, purely just for mutual aid, saying like, hey, I'm unable to pay rent, or hey, I'm unable to feed myself and my kids. If there are any other people who are believing in mutual aid or in social support, like, if you want to support us, that would be fantastic. And people did that. It was a great, distribution of wealth between this community. And talking to many of these people, so many of them were in fact radicalized by the Occupy movement, and then further went into literature, like, Conquest of Bread and such, to further understand, the wealth disparities and the economic injustice. So the Occupy movement has really, over the past decade, I think, provided a lot of awareness, but also action and inspiration to individuals. Yeah, so one of the central ideas in your essay is the concept of unjust social systems as structural sin. And you state that the global money economy may be as close to a direct example of original sin as any we can find. Can you unpack this a little bit for us? What is the difference between original sin and structural sin?
I think what I'm saying is there is no real difference between original sin and structural sin. The concept of original sin has fallen into disrepute for a lot of good reasons. It was used in some really quite bizarre ways over the history of the church, and got weirdly tied up with sex, as if sin was a sexually transmitted disease or something like that. But the idea that we are born into sinful systems, which we did not choose and cannot control, and which begin shaping us even before we are born, we are shaped in utero by the economic conditions which surround us. And it's not our choice, and it's not in our control. And we are compelled to participate in this sinful system, wherever we are in the world, whether we are the victims or whether we are the privileged or whether we're a bit of a mix of both at once. We are compelled from before the moment of our birth to participate in a system which is a system of injustice and inequity and structural sin. We can't escape it. We can't make it not be. We can't make it not shape us. We have been profoundly shaped by it in every moment of our existence. And that, to me, sounds like original sin. That sounds like what the doctrine of original sin is actually meaning to capture, is this sense that we are born in injustice, we are shaped in injustice, we cannot escape it. We can't just say, I'm going to be good and just now. We can't, because everything that has shaped us in our lives and continues to shape us is preventing us from doing that. We can't just say, well, I'm not going to live under capitalism now. I mean, I can say that, but my chances of putting it into practice are pretty minimal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is such a mood. Like,
yeah.
I don't think anything more relatable has been said on this podcast.
Yeah.
Honestly.
That's certainly connects with a lot of my experience of church and community in the past year, 10 years or so, as I remember. I'm starting out as this idealistic undergrad thinking, we're going to build these alternative communities that are that are better places for people to live, better ways for people to live. It's like I and probably a lot of the people that I've done church with have come to this kind of gradual increasing awareness of systemic oppression and privilege, and how we can't simply opt out of that we have to be constantly aware of how those systems operate within our communities.
Yeah, I sort of think of it more now as staging small escapes. We stage as many little escapes as we can, and perhaps they will add up to something bigger. But we can't get outside the system of our own efforts.
Mm-hmm. When you say we can find those little escapes, could you maybe expand on that a little bit or give some examples of what you mean?
I mean, some of it is very, very, tedious stuff. It's like, don't throw away food. Or don't, if people throw away food, go into the dumpsters of supermarkets and recover it. Learn to grow food. Learn to repair your clothes so you're not buying new clothes. Learn to get away from this idea that if you don't buy new clothes, you look like shit. Teach yourself different economic practices. Consuming less, reusing, building, making, learning how to do practical things. Most of us have, in this society, in this particular part of the developed world, have been massively de-skilled. We have very few practical skills. If you think about, if civilization actually collapsed, what could I do that's useful? I know a bit about growing food. I could do that. I know a bit about preserving food. I have rudimentary medic skills. And that's really about the limit of my usefulness.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually interesting that you bring up those ideas and those examples. Like, I myself, I am vegan because I don't want to participate in the, mass consumption and the commercial excess production of meat and meat products. Minimalism is becoming a more and more growing, not just aesthetic, but movement and ideology. The idea of like you don't need to have things, you don't need to have new things, especially clothes, is like the biggest kind of thing that's been surrounding. We've been getting a lot more focus into stuff like recycled materials and such. But I think what's maybe the most interesting that you bring up is, yeah, like what, actual skills do individuals have? It's like living in Toronto, it's like my dad taught me how to change a tire and to like fix most things in a car, or to, change light fixtures, or to, work with, wood to like build a table or build my own desk, right? But then like, 2 blocks over is, a couple of friends who, have never had to wash a dish, who have never had to cook their own meal, who have never had to, work with wood, who have never had to grow their own plants, who have never had to do any of these things. And it's like, but they have fantastic full-time jobs because they work in the business sector, working with the economy, doing international trade and stuff. And it's just like, yeah, I guess it is one of those things of like finding how you can actively work against that, or to opt out of the participation in those small regards. I think that is vital, not just for you know I guess working towards a future after the fall of Babylon. But I think it's also incredibly vital for like the mental health of the
Mm-hmm.
individual as well. To know, especially in the age of information. You know,
Yeah. Now
we
we're
have
yeah.
everything. Sorry, yeah.
I was going to say we're talking about a set of choices being made by people with privilege. And that's important to talk about because most of the people who are going to be listening to this or reading my paper are people who do have some privilege. We also need to be aware that for people who have been much more significantly deprived and victimized by the system, the set of choices that is healthy for them to make, that is good, is life giving for them to make, that is a means of escape, is different. Um, People who are extremely poor in this society, in Canada and a developed country, so what I'm saying is only true of this context, often have a great deal of stuff, sometimes tremendous quantities of stuff, and it's all shit. And it breaks, and it's throwaway consumer trash because that's all that you can afford if you're poor.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
landfill items.
Yeah, so for people who have only experienced trash material culture, the opportunity to experience a material culture which is deep and rich and beautiful and true is I think potentially also quite revolutionary.
All right.
Okay. Yeah,
okay.
what I was actually doing out there, we we pick up discarded food from a No Frills in Scarborough every day. So I was just unloading and working out what we can use for our meal programs here.
Hmm. Yeah, that's actually what I one part of what I was interested in asking about. Now that as you were talking about our relationships to material culture and how different those relationships are, depending on varying levels of privilege. So I know that you and other people at St. Stephen's put a huge amount of time and resources into, well, I'm helping people to stay alive, running drop-in programs that support the basic needs of people who are homeless or deeply impoverished. And my experience in working in these kind of contexts is that there's often a huge power imbalance between those providing support and those receiving it. And it can be hard to establish genuine human relationships, both because of the power imbalance and the different relationships to material culture that you described, generally the differences in experience. So I'm wondering if your theology of money, or more broadly, a systemic perspective on money, offers any helpful principles for building relationships of solidarity across economic disparity.
I don't know. I would say it certainly motivates one to want to do that. Whether it helps one to do so effectively is maybe a different question. I mean, I think the first thing that is important, and where sometimes things do fall down, is that we need to acknowledge the power difference. We can't pretend that it doesn't exist. We can't pretend that our lives are not dramatically different, and I can't pretend that I don't have more power. I do have more power. I mean, within the context of the church programs, I am the person who has the final power, which is the power to ban people from the building. I've never exercised that power, but that doesn't change the fact that I have it, and that alters how people relate to me. Inevitably, it does. The best I can do is to openly acknowledge that, and to try to talk about how I manage that, and not to expect that people are going to be my friend. I think it is an extremely unfair expectation that people who are suffering greatly under this whole economic system will be my friends in order to make me feel better about the fact that I am giving them some basic necessities of life. I think I have good relationships with a lot of people, but that's partly because I never presume that anyone wants to be my friend. I think we've established very trusting relationships in a lot of cases. I hope so. But they're complex relationships, and we need to acknowledge that complexity. The pandemic has made things much harder. It's created a lot of barriers in, a situation which we had consciously tried to make an extreme low barrier situation. We have necessarily now had to create barriers. Masks, capacity limits, rules about what people can and can't do. The food is served in a less friendly way. We can't do buffets anymore. All of these things have changed the dynamic of the meals and the drop-in here in ways that I really don't like, but which have been unavoidable. One of the things we've for many, many years tried to be very conscious about was that there should not be a line between the people who receive services and the people who attend services. It's interesting the same word is used for both. but that people who come to the meals, who come to the drop-in, also come to the liturgies. Since we've had to move online, that has not been the case. Because obviously, if you're living on the street, accessing a Zoom service is not going to be a thing you can do. And that's been a real painful loss. It has created a pretty sharp line division where I had worked really, really hard to minimize that division. And that's been a difficult thing to work with. I think we've got a little bit of emergence from the pandemic happening now. Maybe there's some level of vaccination. We don't know how this is going to go, but it's creating a whole set of additional barriers that make things hard. But in terms of access to material culture, I will say one of the great guiding inspirations of the Anglo-Catholic movement, and one reason that I identify very strongly with that movement, was a sense that beauty should be accessible to everyone. That it is very important that the liturgy should be beautiful, and that it should be beautiful in as multisensory a way as possible, that there should be visual and auditory, there should be smells, there should be music, there should be everything, because a church service is something that, at least in theory, everyone can access. It is a way of making beauty broadly available to people who have no beauty in their lives. To go to an art gallery or a concert or anything else, even if it's not financially expensive, which it often is, it requires a tremendous amount of social capital. And you need to have a certain kind of clothing, and you need to have a certain standard of personal hygiene, which maybe you can't maintain if you're only able to shower once a week. There's a lot of barriers to beauty. And the part of the Anglo-Catholic inspiration is to try to make that beauty very broadly available to everyone. And I really hope that the next phase of the pandemic develops in such a way that we can get back to doing that. Because that's been a big part of what I try to do as a church leader.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of some experiences from when I was involved with the Dale, which is a church community largely made up of people living in Parkdale who are homeless or impoverished. One being that the worship services of that congregation, it's very much based in the Protestant tradition, and yet the members of that community made it very clear that, or at least some did, that it was important to have communion every week, which to me really speaks to the importance of that, multi-sensory or embodied connection to liturgy, and connecting the material to the sacred. And the other was a few years back in that community that photographer gave cameras to a number of community members, and seemed a little bit surprised that the photos that came back that these community members took very often were not sort of images of gritty street life that he might have expected, but were pictures of the lake, the trees in the park, the kind of the beauty, the few spaces in which beauty is accessible to everyone in the city.
Well, Maggie, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. We learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners did too. So thank you very much for being with us here today and answering our questions.
All right, thank you, and thank you for putting up with the interruptions.
Okay, thanks so much, Maggie.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Dunc, I'd love to hear what you were thinking during an interview. What struck you about our conversation?
Yeah, I really thought it was interesting what Maggie was trying to do in, starting a conversation, as opposed to, providing all the answers or to make an action plan. And I think that's a value that has been less on people's minds, or people have been less open to that idea, right? To, like, think about looking inward and to start asking questions, which is very much like what the humanities as an academic field is about, and theology is in, that humanities field. And so, you mentioned before with the Cahoots Festival, people talking about, like, how do I manage my family's budget? It's like people want the answers, but people don't want to, like, explore these ideas necessarily, or they don't want to think too much about, their participation in these things. And so I think there's, like, a bit of a disconnect um, between those two things that, needs to be discussed. But I think what's really interesting is that Maggie brings up this new interpretation of, original sin, or rather structural sin, as she refers to it. And I thought that was super interesting because, the way that original sin is documented in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic texts, it's very much in a broad, sort of open interpretation way, as much of the Bible is. And so what I found really interesting about that was that it kind of removed the ownership of the original sin, or the structural sin, away from the individual who was born into this with no choice, but rather saying, it's not necessarily your fault that you've done this. It is the fact that you were born into a system that is a sinful system. You are born into an unfair and unjust society, and that is what that is, and you are obligated to participate in it. And so in that way, you are obligated to participate in this structural sin, or this original sin, um, purely by the happenstance of your birth. And I think that's so much more helpful to think about in a theological lens, because it takes away, I guess, like the older Catholic ideas of guilt, right? And that internalized guilt, that internalized, maybe even self-hatred is how it's been described before. Talking about that makes it more of like, okay, well, it's like we have a possibility to go past that. We have a possibility to, you know, make this better. We have a possibility to remove this structural sin. We have a way to remove this original sin from ourselves and work forward, right? It's that same idea that she was saying, like, it's like, after the fall of Babylon, and those who took the government's money versus those who, stood up and against oppression. Um, it's about that choice that can be made, and I think it brings the idea of choice, and I think it brings a much more larger sense of agency, as we have free will. We have the freedom to work against this system as we choose, and I mean, it's more complicated than just choosing to be in it and choosing not to be in it. And I think Maggie also talked about the little things that people can do. And I think it's funny to hear about that from someone who's obviously participating in so many things, and maybe even close to burnout. Like, Maggie is participating in so many different organizations and doing so much work towards the community and against the system. Um, you know, Providing those little opportunities and those little choices in day-to-day life helps reduce the overall anxiety of it. And that's so important.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of amazed at um, how much the theology of money, and this idea of money, the economic system as structural sin with um, lines up with the lens of oppression and privilege. Not understanding that it's not our fault that we are in this system, and that we have to participate in this system, that it's unavoidable to end up being complicit in some ways, and it is our responsibility to I'm I'm use the power that we have um, in the most ethical ways possible to make the most ethical choices possible in our own situations. I know that's I think some of the reason that church communities, well, people in general often don't like to talk about economic injustice is that it can be so overwhelming and so depressing. Um, and yet I can actually see a lot of resources in the Christian theological tradition around kind of the daily practice of self-examination and repentance, not in a kind of not in the sense of kind of guilt and pleading for forgiveness, but in the sense of choosing every day to change what you can change.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think that, yeah, that even goes to the Gospels, right? I mean, looking at the fact that, Christ died for our sins, but that's a very simplified way of saying Christ died because he was a political activist actively working against the oppressive regime of the Roman Empire. Um, I think it's really important to talk about that because, especially when you have so many, super conservative Christians, it really sounds like an oxymoron when you actually read these theological frameworks of how you could be like a financially or economically conservative or even socially conservative Christian. Um, and, maybe people are going to be mad at me for saying that, but like, it's true. This economic system that we have, based on disparity and the labor of others, it's horrendous. And if you look at the texts, it directly talks about this. And even if you look at, you know, I took like an economics course in my undergrad, and one of the first things, and really the thing that really struck out to me was the fact that in economics there are two forms of labor. There are two forms of labor that are pivotal for economic and social political success, and that is formal labor and informal labor. And I don't think the Bible or the Gospels or even the rabbinical texts uh, talk much about this, but the Quran does. So I do want to mention that because formal labor is designated as participating in like the business or the larger functions of society. So, trade and, skilled labor and, things that you would go and get a job for, right? Like you would go and like, apply for a job, get paid, get a payroll, whatever. But informal work is just as vital to the long-term success of an economy. And informal work is described as the things that you don't get paid for but are vital, which is very much associated with like, maintaining a proper household, right? And like raising your kids so they can be productive members of society, right? Or they can do the things that they need to do to make society better, right? Education is one of those, right? And, making sure and supporting those who are laboring is one of those things, right? So like, when you have the idea of like a, I guess like a nuclear family, right? Like we are like those traditional, marriage values or whatever that people call it. You have like usually it's like the man goes out, does work, that's formal labor, and the woman is meant to, keep the house in an orderly fashion, to take care of the kids and to cook and provide food on the table and to support their partner. And all of those things is that's informal labor, and that is just as vital to society in the long run, because that's how you create a longer lasting civilization. You have to work towards the future, right? You have to make sure that these things are happening. And so that's why people had these like traditional values or whatever. But, in Islam, in the Quran, it actually dictates that if, say, well, what they say is like if a man is working and the woman is not working, like in that, traditional or I guess like formal labor, if the wife is meant to stay at home and do that informal work, then they should be getting a wage to create a level of independence from their husband so they're not relying on it, because that is vital to a society. And so they talk about these things like if you are doing these things, you should be getting some sort of compensation in the economy for such things.
Yes, that is really cool.
Yeah, and it's necessary. Like you need to be thinking about these things. Like people say like, "Oh, it's just like, well, it's like why would you pay for a nanny?" It's like, "Well, because that work is work that is productive to society and is needed to be recognized. So there needs to be some sort of compensation for that." Right. And, if you have a housewife, usually, I mean, people like share bank accounts or whatever, like when they're married, or a house husband would share bank accounts with their wife. But like, you need to have those levels of stability and you need to support that. And that is on those doing the formal work. Those doing the formal work need to support those who are helping them through the informal work, because we're all in this together and we're all working towards this together. It's vital that all of these parts are played together and done with respect and mutual, yeah, honestly, just mutual respect for one another.
Yes. Yeah, that's a piece that often feels like it's really eroding in our social context, that, as more privileged women are, moving into well-paid careers, that so much of that domestic work and care work is getting displaced onto poorer, usually racialized women to whom um, the more, you know who are not being treated with the same kind of respect and sense of responsibility that someone would would treat someone who's a member of their family.
Yeah, precisely so. It's necessary, and these support systems need to be put in place. And I think what Maggie is getting at is that Islamic idea of social support, because we're all in this together and we're all doing this together. So we need to be, providing that mutual aid. We need to be, working against the things that are keeping us apart, against the things that are actively disenfranchising people. I think that's that. Yeah, basically, Maggie is on her way to Islam.
Or I was actually a piece that I was thinking of when you were mentioning when you were talking about all this is a biblical interpretation that I've heard Maggie preach on, that haven't heard from anyone else, which is Jesus as a man who shows respect for women by doing women's work. That Jesus is a man who feeds people and um, cares for people who are sick and disabled, and shows regard for children, and uh, washes his disciples' feet, all of which in that social context were almost exclusively women's work and frequently the work of enslaved people.
Precisely so, and he did that with care and love and respect.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, Jesus says, I give you a new commandment. Love one another and do as I do. Right? Follow me. Follow what I do and do as I do, and you will be saved. Right? That's the whole thing, and it's to love one another, to respect one another, and to do as he would do. So yeah, it's kind of that WWJD, like what would Jesus do? It's like, well, Jesus, rolled up his sleeves and did this work no matter if no matter if people thought that it was beneath him, right? He opted out of these social ways, or rather these social prisons, in the ways that he could, right? He spoke up against these things, and that's exactly what I think Maggie is talking about in her essay as well. It's like, starting that conversation of like, well, how can we, actively do what Christ is teaching us to do, right? How can we actively opt out of this structural sin?
Yeah, so something I was very curious about when you mentioned what your experience, your connections to Muslim communities, was the tradition of Islamic banking. As I know what we were talking about as we were discussing with Maggie, our global economic system is based on debt, which the Bible very clearly condemns as usury, as an exploitative system that should be avoided. And the only thing I know about Islamic banking is that it is intended to be a financial system that is not based on usury. So I'd love to hear anything that you can share about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not like an expert in Islamic banking. I honestly haven't heard that term much, but what I can talk about is like what the Quran says and what I was taught in like being raised in a Muslim community and such. And that is, there are certain things where you are taught, it's how do I word this? So in the there's the old proverb, I think it is in the Bible. It's like you teach, you give a man a fish and he eats for a day, and you teach a man to fish, and he can eat for a lifetime. And in Islam, they kind of talk about this a little bit. And what I've heard from imams is what you should do is you should not just teach the man to fish, but you should teach the man to fish. And you should, if you have an extra fishing rod, give him the fishing rod. And then maybe even, if you have the ability to do so, loan him some money to start up maybe a business or to start up some sort of financial structure. And that would be a loan probably with no interest. But to, pay that money forward and to, help the individual so that he can create a system where he is feeding his family, where he is feeding those in need, where he is doing all these things purely out of the goodness of his heart, which was only possible after the goodness that you have done out of your heart. So it's kind of more about that. It's not just about teaching someone to do something or helping someone in the time of need. It's about setting them up for long-term security with those new skills. So that's really what, like, the Muslim teachings, from what I've been taught, are more targeted towards. It's about longer lasting sustainability with those resources. So yeah, it's about making sure that everyone has enough, and making sure that people do, but also not necessarily always framing it as like a handout, like, oh yeah, I'm giving you this money so you can get a boat, right? It's, I'm loaning you this money so that you have a boat, and when you are in a financial position where you are making enough money to put some aside to pay me back, then you can pay me back, and that's great, right? And even that, like, inspires, or theoretically, what it does is it inspires the individual to work hard and to do things well so that they can get to that point where they are able to put money away and to save things and to, have those resources in a sense of comfort so that that money can be paid back, or even better yet, paid forward. Right. So it's not just about, like, feeding the hungry. It's not just about, giving people, like, it's not just about providing skills for those who are disenfranchised. It's about providing skills and providing the resources and providing a system that will help them throughout their lifetime, and ideally throughout their children's lifetime and their children ahead of them. If you get that, you give them the loan for the boat, they get the boat, they become a fisher, and now they have something they can give on to their kids, right? And then their kids can give on to their kids, and maybe they can accumulate a certain amount of excess wealth, whatever, to pay that back towards someone else who needs it, right? And to do that, that is the obligation that we are given by Allah, right, or God, right? That is our obligation.
Yeah, and that's a system that actually is sustainable, because I mean the whole premise of a system based on debt and interest only works with the assumption of infinite economic growth, that it's possible to repay what's being lent with interest without ending up worse off. And yeah,
Well, I
that
mean, that I think that's implying that this economic model is has a beneficial ethos. I think it's more safe to say that the system with debt and with interest and with all these things is actively against that. It is designed in a way to keep those who are disenfranchised continuously disenfranchised. I mean, you look at the fact that, millennials are constantly talking about the fact that we can't own a home, right? And, Generation X, even with all of, millennial student loans and everything, Generation X is still the most in debt generation ever. And that's because, there was a system set up by the generation before them, which was the baby boomers, right? They gave into Reaganomics, they did all these things that worked really beneficially for them. But then it set up this lifestyle and, I guess this like social wealth or these social contracts that Maggie was talking about, but like, showering and wearing the right clothes and having the right things and having the nice things, all that stuff, that was all set up into the psyche and the mindset of Gen X people. But these Gen X folks didn't have that same amount of income, right? They didn't have these things working towards them by like the greatest generation before the baby boomers, right? So it's like they didn't have this huge economic boost to like help them and to provide this great amount of wealth, and the inflation of prices for things and the inflation for wages, it's not on par, right? So then you have this like huge disparity between what is expected of you and what you feel like you have to have versus what you can actually afford to have, right? And then millennials are seeing that and being like, oh shit, we have nothing. We like, there's nothing left for us, right? And then now you have like the Generation Z kids, right? Like my little brother who's just like, when I was talking about the fact that like, oh yeah, it's like I'm paying a little bit extra on my credit card interest, but that's gonna boost my credit score, more over the long run, so that maybe I can afford a house someday. He's looking at me, he's just like, you think there are gonna be houses left when like the
hmm,
world is on fire?
hmm, yep.
It's yeah. There's no hope in that generation. As a whole, obviously individuals are. Um, different in their mindsets, but there is so little hope.
Well,
um
certainly no hope of going back to kind of the American dream of everyone having middle class lifestyles. But once I mean, like Maggie was talking about this, once Babylon falls, things could go in many possible directions.
yeah, 100%. And I thought it was really interesting when Maggie brought up the idea of like the fall of Babylon and moving on after that. Because all I could think of was just like my little brother, born in 2002, purely Gen Z kid, just being like, okay, cool, but like Babylon didn't have to worry about like the earth dying, because like that's what we are in our globalist society. Like Babylon was one area. It was a city state and it collapsed. and like there were other civilizations going on around, right? Like there were other people, there were other places to go, there were so many things to do. Like after the fall of Babylon, after the fall of the Roman Empire, like there was outside resources, there was still stuff to be there was still resources in those areas to be used by those remaining. But like in this globalized society that we have, post Cold War, in the way that we have been transforming the earth in the Anthropocene, do we still actually have room for the fall of Babylon, or is that just going to be the end for us? Like it's that's the question I think that really comes up, is like, do we have the patience, or rather, like, can we wait out until the fall of Babylon, or is the fall of Babylon just going to be this time the end of it all? Because like, yeah, if we don't have resources, if the planet is inhospitable, then how do we move forward?
Yeah, you're right. I don't think we can just sit back and wait for the system to collapse. Things are already far too dire to keep going in this direction. But yeah, I do actually really appreciate the Gen Z awareness of how fundamentally unsustainable and unhealthy our economic system is, and how urgent it is to transform it.
Yeah, we're living through history. Isn't that so much fun?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, our debrief has been going on for half an hour now, so I think we might need to sign off.
Yeah, I guess we should wrap this up. Well, hopefully that was a good mic drop.
Yeah. All right. Planet's dying. Peace out. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Spirits Rising. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, and all your favorite podcasting apps. Our thanks to the Student Christian Movements for supporting this project, and especially to the SEM North Partnership with St. Theodore of Canterbury Anglican Church and the Diocese of Toronto's Reach Group.